good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to our virtual tour of the oat variety trials here in South Dakota. My name is Jonathan Kleinjan. I'm the Director of Crop Testing and Extension Agronomist here at South Dakota State. And today we have the oat breeder, Dr. Melanie Caffe-Treml, our cereal pathologist, extension pathologist, Dr. Emmanuel Byamukama, and Paul Richter from General Mills, who's a big supporter of the oat breeding program here at South Dakota State University. So today we're going to be going through some of these oat varieties and talk about each one. Melanie will probably give a few words about her breeding program and some of her experimental lines. Dr. Byamukama will talk a little bit about disease pressure in oats and management concerns, and Paul Richter from General Mills will have some brief comments on General Mills' role in oat research here and what their goals are for themselves. Okay, Melanie and I are going to walk through each of the varieties in the crop testing program. Just to explain briefly how that works, we have 9 locations throughout the state where we look at several different release varieties, public varieties, and experimental lines from Melanie's program. We are here at the Volga Research Farm just west of Brookings, and what's unique about this location is we have the trial replicated with fungicide treated to my right and non-fungicide treated to my left, so that we can see the difference between fungicide applications on the different oat varieties. 7 locations throughout the state. We will have these signs set up starting on the week of July 6th. So you are welcome to come and view the plots on your own. We'll have a document box with a handout so you can walk through. The first replication will be staked. The directions from this will be posted on the SDSU Extension website. So with that, we'll start going through the varieties. First one we have here is Antigo. Antigo is from Wisconsin. I believe this is the 3rd or 4th year of testing for this variety. Very good test weight and good protein. That's a yellow hulled variety, one of the 2 we have in the trials. However, yields have really only been about average in the eastern part of the state, and I'd say below average in central and western South Dakota. So this is probably fairly well adapted in Wisconsin, but it doesn't seem to transfer over to South Dakota very well. Melanie, do you have any comments?
Yeah, one thing to be aware of, this variety has very small kernel, and so a lot of proportion of seeds. So for the milling industry, it might not fit their standards.
Okay, the next variety in the trial is CS Camden. This is from Canterra seeds based out of Winnipeg. This one's been in the trial, I believe, for 5 years. Very strong yields. It's a very late maturing. I think it's a relatively good end-use quality, but Melanie would probably have some more comments about that.
Yeah, it fits well for the milling market. The downside of that one is low test weight.
Yeah, this one will typically have the lowest test weight in the trial. Okay, the next variety is Dion from the University of Minnesota. I believe it was released in 2012. This is another yellow hulled variety, fairly tall, but stands well. It's got good crown rust resistant. It was one of the first locally adapted crown rust resistant lines for this region. We have seen a little bit of susceptibility in recent years, but still very good crown rust resistance. I would say arguably this is still the one that we kind of shoot for to beat. Just a good consistent yielder.
On the eastern part of the state, yeah. When we have where crown rust is a problem, this one has been performing really well.
Okay, Esker 2020 is a new one in the South Dakota trials, so honestly we don't know much about it. It's probably agronomically very similar to Esker, which is released back in 2004, but honestly don't know much about that one either. So advertised as a very high yielder in Wisconsin. I guess we'll see how it does in South Dakota.
Yeah, it's Wisconsin's newest release.
Okay, next we have one that's easy to pick out. This one is named Goliath. This is a South Dakota release. As you can see, it's a very tall variety. This is a good choice for forage. I think it was 5 tons an acre, average statewide last year in the 2019 forage trials that Melanie puts on. Solid grain yields too, I would say, especially in central and western South Dakota. It is moderately susceptible to crown rust, so you might want to consider a fungicide and be careful of lodging in high yield situations.
It has good test weight, and yeah, that one has been a choice for forage. But so you want to probably apply a fungicide at flag leaf on it. But that's one that we're trying to do also some forage trial and releasing some new variety for forage. But so far, this one would be the recommended one.
Okay, next we have Hayden. Hayden was one of Melanie's first releases when she started as the oat breeder here at SDSU. Hayden is a good choice for forage, but also excellent grain production. However, you will want to use a fungicide with Hayden. So it can produce yields near the top of the trial, but you have to keep the flag leaf clean because it is moderately susceptible to crown rust.
This one has also performed well in our forage trials. So this one could be both grain and forage. As far as grain characteristic, it has high test weight and it fits also the milling industry. So it can be both food and feed market. The only reason on this eastern part of the state is because of crown rust susceptibility, but when you do not have crown rust, this one is a top yielder from South Dakota up to New York.
Okay, now we have MN Pearl from Minnesota. This is their newest release. This is the second year that we've seen it in the trials. We had it as an experimental last year. It did fairly well last year, so I would say yield-wise and test weight-wise similar to Dion. We'll see how it does. Never gauge a variety on 1 year's performance, so I like to see 3 years of data. If you don't have 3 years, 2 years, but 1 year is not always the best picture. However, this one does look very promising.
So this one has, we see some pestle of crown rust on it, similar to what we see on Dion last year. So it has moderate resistance to crown rust.
Next we have Natty. Natty was released the same year as Hayden, which we discussed earlier. So again, one of Melanie's first releases here. This one's slightly shorter than Hayden and more early maturing. It does probably not have quite the yield potential that Hayden does, but if you want an early maturing variety, this one is pretty good.
Well, as far as milling, this one is low beta-glucan, so it doesn't fit as well the milling market.
I would say yields probably average to above average, so it's not going to be the top yielder, but it has been fairly consistent.
Yeah, for an early variety, it yields pretty well.
The next variety we're going to talk about is Rushmore. This is the latest release from Melanie's program here at South Dakota State, released last fall, 2019. Rushmore has very good yield potential, very good standability.
And a high test weight. And as far as kernel size, it's pretty large kernel, so it also fit well for the milling market. It is mid-maturity. Overall, it has performed well on the east and central South Dakota.
And resistant to crown rust, right? Or moderately resistant?
It is moderately resistant to crown rust. So we can see some pustules, but not a lot, and we can still have a decent yield even when we have heavy crown rust pressure.
All right, next we have Saddle. I think it was released 3 years ago from South Dakota, Melanie?
Yeah, 2017.
Also moderately resistant to crown rust, very good standability. I think it's probably got the best lodging score of anything, of any of the released varieties in the trial. Well adapted to eastern South Dakota and maybe central South Dakota, but probably not western South Dakota.
This one, as far as crown rust, I would even rate it resistant because it's better resistant than Rushmore or Dion. Last year we've seen less crown rust pustules on that one. As far as maturity, this one and Antigo are both the earliest maturing of the entire trial, so very early maturity. And this one also fits the milling market.
So if you prefer an early maturing variety and you're in the eastern part of the state, if you're a fan of the variety Natty, Saddle is probably a better choice. You'll get better yields and better standability. Okay, next we have Shelby 427. This is the oldest material we have in the crop testing program as of now. So this was released from South Dakota 2009. Very good yielder back in its day, but it's just getting some age on it and it's susceptible to crown rust. You can just see the leaves are really fairly well infected with crown rust. And yields in CPT are near the bottom, probably statewide.
Yeah, so Natty was actually released as a replacement for Shelby. Another early maturing variety with good test weight.
Okay, the last named variety we have in the trials is Warrior. This was released from South Dakota State in 2018, I believe. Named primarily because of its high yields. I guess we call it a yield warrior. So other than high yielding, it's resistant to crown rust. It has performed well, especially central and eastern part of the state. And I would say out of the recent releases, it probably does better in the western part of the state than maybe Rushmore or Saddle. Maybe I'm a little bit wrong there.
I would say both Rushmore and Warrior are okay, central part of the state. Saddle, I would recommend more on the eastern part of the state. This one seems to be a little bit more stable for yield than saddle.
Okay, next we start talking about some of our experimental lines. The first one we have is an experimental line from General Mills, and here to discuss that is Paul Richter, who is the oat breeder.
Hello everyone. Yes, so I'm an oat breeder for General Mills, but I'm stationed here at the SDSU campus here in Brookings, and we work closely with Melanie. We share lab space, we share resources, and we have one variety just for the first year in CPT. It's 2015 3232. It's got higher beta glucan than average, average test weight, really good yield for maturity. It's a couple of days earlier than Hayden, a couple days later than the Antigo. We'll see how it performs. I'm excited about it. It's got really, we focus on processing characteristics like large kernel size, high growth percentage, and high beta glucan. And this is starting a real effort here in the Dakotas. We've had a breeding program for a while. Previously we had targeted Canada. Now we're targeting the Dakotas.
Okay, the last two experimental lines I don't know a thing about, so Melanie's going to handle that.
So every year we test about 10 breeding lines in the CPT, and so before we release we want to have at least 3 years of testing in the CPT and see how they compare to current variety that are released. We have two here that are closest to release, SD140741 here, and this one SD150012. Those are that's the third year of testing in the CPT. So by the end of this season, we'll have an idea of whether they can be released or not. They've been both promising. This one has shown good yield across the state, especially east and central part of the state, with a good crown rust resistance. The test weight is similar to Dion Saddle Warrior. This one has been the top yielder over the entire state over the last 2 years, and it has excellent test weight, even better than those other one. This one has a little bit more protein than that one, but overall those two are really promising with a good level of crown rust resistance. So we're waiting the end of the season to see if they can be released.
As Melanie said, we have a release meeting and it'll be in November. So if these two perform well, they've both performed well throughout the state the last couple of years. We'll have, as she said, the third year of data this year. And if they both perform well, the release committee will probably recommend the release of both of these varieties this fall, but we'll see how things turn out.
So hi everyone, my name is Emmanuel Byamukama. I'm the extension plant pathologist here at South Dakota State. And here in this CPT trial, we're talking about diseases that affects the oats. And basically we have two main diseases. The first one is crown rust, and the second one is barley yellow dwarf. These two diseases really can impact yield, especially crown rust, where you have a susceptible variety, you can have a big hit on yield because of this disease. So right here I'm standing amidst two varieties that have different levels of susceptibility to crown rust. And this one on my left, you can see how all the leaves are orange and they're covered with the rust. So crown rust is really a bad disease for oats. And some of our susceptible varieties, you can have up to 40% yield loss because of this disease. But luckily, thanks to breeders, we do have good lines, good varieties that are resistant to this disease. So right here on my right, we have a variety that looks really good. No pustules of this rust on the leaves. And so please make sure you're selecting a variety that is resistant to crown rust. That's one way that we can effectively control this disease. If you're planting a variety that is susceptible to crown rust because of good yields and because of other reasons, perhaps good straw and so on, then you can use a fungicide to control crown rust. So a fungicide that is applied right at flag leaf emergency, you can have very good control of this disease and get good yields even when your variety is susceptible, except that you're adding an additional cost of using a fungicide. So our number one recommendation would be to look for a variety that is resistant to crown rust, and the oats breeding program here at SDSU has several lines, several varieties that are resistant to crown rust, so make sure you use those. The second disease that I'll talk about is a virus disease. It's called barley yellow dwarf virus. Luckily, this virus is not widespread in oats, but once in a while you'll find tillers or entire plant stands that have been killed by this virus. The typical symptoms of barley yellow dwarf is the purpling of leaves starting from the leaf tip, going in, and eventually the whole plant may die because of this virus. I have here a few tillers that have been killed because of barley yellow dwarf virus. Now, unfortunately, like many viral diseases, there is no in-season treatment that we can use to control barley yellow dwarf. It is spread by insects. The aphids are the culprits for this virus. So when they feed on a sick plant like these and then move on and feed on a healthy plant, then they transmit the barley yellow dwarf virus. So the best way to control this virus disease is, if you're planting early, sometimes we can use a seed treatment to control the aphids that may come to feed on young plants. But usually that's an added expense. And so we recommend just looking for a variety that is tolerant to barley yellow dwarf. And as I mentioned, it's not a disease that we find a lot. In other words, it's not widely spread and it's not affecting a lot of plants in the field. You may find it here and there in the field, but one disease to be aware of and not to confuse it with other diseases. So briefly again, just recap, two major diseases in oats. Number one, crown rust, and number two, barley yellow dwarf. The main serious one is crown rust. It can really take out yield. A lot of yield can be lost because of this disease. One thing I should mention about crown rust is that its inoculum actually comes from the bark thorns, and we do have quite a lot of those in our area, so we do have a lot of inoculums. So you're better off looking for a good variety, and then if using a variety that is susceptible, use a fungicide at flag leaf in order to control crown rust.
Hello, I'm Paul Richter from General Mills, stationed here at SDSU campus in Brookings. And I want to talk a little bit about General Mills' presence here in Brookings and our work with SDSU. 4 years ago, we got invited by SDSU to form a collaboration, and I've got to say it's worked well. We share lab space, we share resources, and most importantly, we share ideas. Melanie has an office right across the hall from me, and so while our programs emphasize different things, we work together, and it's really important for General Mills, and I think the oat industry in general, to make sure, since half of the oats that's grown is used for human food, that we have oats that work well for the processing industry. And so our emphasis is more on the processing side. Melanie and her program is more in the forage and feed, but also processing. So, and we like I say, we bounce ideas off each other every day, and that is extremely helpful.
Thank you for joining us today for the virtual oat tour. I'd like to thank Melanie and Emmanuel for helping, and I'd like to thank General Mills for their support of the oat breeding program and the CPT at SDSU.
I'd like to thank the sponsors for the breeding program. We have support from grain millers and also from the South Dakota Crop Improvement Association, in addition to General Mills.